Now, if I make it interactive, that means then the microphone will
Ideally, it would be great for
make sure I have everything. Yeah. All right.
Okay, good evening. Good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? Oh, I'm audible. Awesome. Alrighty, we're going to start here. So thank you so much for coming out on a Thursday night. It's a Throwback Thursday. If nobody knows, there is an American Humanist Association conference going on in Las Vegas, like next weekend, I think. So if you're not busy, you want to go do something, we have some flyers around here somewhere. They used to be on this table.
Yes, they're on that table there.
They're on the table up front, this little black table. So you can grab them on your way
They
out.
look like that.
So if you're looking to have a good time, play some laser tag, eat some buffet food, that's always available. If you have a cell phone, if you could silence it, turn it off, mute it, explode it.
Is your microphone on?
It claims to be on.
Turn it up a little bit.
Hello, John. John? I'm getting deep in my old age.
Sorry, John. Those dials, they're fiddly.
Hi, John.
Okay, so how's everybody doing tonight?
Hey.
I'm not feeling it. How you doing tonight? Alrighty. Well, we are the Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix. I am your host, Chris, the president. You're a secular oasis here in the Valley, and we're proud to present our speaker tonight. But before we get to that, I had a couple of announcements. Anybody here for the very first time? No, all regulars. Okay, awesome. Well, thanks to Mary and Ed for being here for the very first time. Anyway, don't forget to check out our next Sunday speaker. It's with Tom Lombardo. He's going to be talking about future evolution, about how we can use evolution to our advantage. It's going to be pretty awesome on May 20th. At our normal time, see us at breakfast at 9 a.m. and the meeting is at 10. So appreciate you being here and your support. We do run on donations, so if you like what we do, you like this presentation, costs money. The air conditioner in the house is on its last, well, I would say leg, but the leg is almost gone too. It's on its last peg. So yeah, place does run donations. If you like what we do, feed the jar. It's awesome, and you support programs like this and awesome people to come in and talk to us.
Patreon.
And we also have a new Patreon account. You can look us up at Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix on Patreon.
That's correct.
And you can watch this presentation on YouTube. If you miss anything awesome, just go to our YouTube channel, Humanist Society of Greater Phoenix, and you can watch this whole presentation online at your leisure. I'm going to invite Pam to come up and introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm very excited about our speaker this evening, and he was also really nice to give me a great background of everything that he's done, and it really only scratches the surface because I actually read a little bit more. This is one busy guy. So let me tell you a little bit about Fred Edwords. Fred Edwards has a long history in organized humanism. For 15 years, he was executive director of the American Humanist Association, for 12 years, editor of the Humanist magazine, and for 6 years, national director of the United Coalition of Reason. He is past president of Camp Quest, a summer camp for free-thinking children. We know a little bit about Camp Quest. And has served on the board of the International Humanist and Ethical Union and the founding board of the National Center for Science Education. As a continuing voice for humanist idea, he has, over the past 40 years, appeared on national and local radio and television in the United States, Canada, and has been interviewed on radio for newspapers around the world, and has lectured in North America, Europe, and India. In the 1970s and 80s, he successfully debated the leading U.S. and Canadian creationists on college campuses around the country. Today, he is Director of Planned Giving for the Humanist Foundation of the American Humanist Association, and would be pleased to help you provide a future for your humanist value in your will and other estate plan. He also serves on the adjunct faculty of the Humanist Institute, is the American Humanist Association's historian, and sits on the board Social Impacts Committee of the Hall of Human Origins at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. God, I'm tired just saying in Washington, D.C. Quite amazing. So please help me welcome Fred Edwards.
All right, so,
That's better.
can you hear me?
Yeah.
We couldn't hear the other microphone at all.
No.
Oh,
That's off.
do you want to turn this one down?
Yeah, that was you. We couldn't hear you.
All right, so this is okay, not too loud, not too soft? Okay. All right,
It's too loud.
it's too loud. All right, well, this guy's gonna fix it. If it were just me, I'd just talk to you without a microphone and you'd all hear me. All right, so I was asked to talk to you about something a little more upbeat. You know, we turn on the TV and watch the news, and we're depressed once again. And we're depressed every damn day. So it just keeps on going and going. And we got this Energizer bunny in the White House, but it's not building our energy. So I'm going to talk to you about the humanist values that we have and how they are being successful. But I want your participation. So this isn't going to be where I stand up and just talk at you for 45 minutes and then y'all get 15 minutes to, you know, ask questions or stand up and pontificate. No. I'm going to involve you in this because I know you have opinions, and being humanists, we all have opinions and we all think each other's wrong. That's kind of the way we do it. So I want to engage with you, and I want you to engage with each other on this. So I'm talking on the power of humanist values in difficult times, and we're living in difficult times. We need to know that our values do make a difference. So when we think about the turmoil of today, we certainly are justified in focusing on the problems of our troubled nation and world. But as we immerse ourselves in this daily news stream and everything about the news that frustrates us, it's easy to forget what powerful intellectual tools we human beings have at our disposal. It's easy to forget how successful our wielding of those tools has been in the past. And it's easy to lose sight of how wonderfully far our democratic values have taken the world, how far those values have taken the world in a positive direction. Now, when I say democratic values, what am I talking about? When you hear the word democracy, what do you think of? Raise your hand.
Power of the people.
What?
Power of the people.
Power of the people. All right? Anyone else like to comment on what you take democracy to mean? When you hear that word, yes.
It's only a democracy if you participate.
Okay, it's only a democracy if you participate. Yes.
Collective assent.
Collective assent. All right, good. Any other thoughts? Okay, well, what I'm going to do is go back in time a little bit. We'll take a trip down memory lane, although it's going to be back before most of you remembered anything. We're going to go back to the Peloponnesian War in ancient Greece. Okay, so now it was near the end of the first year of this war that the people of Athens conducted a funeral to honor their fellow citizens who'd fallen in battle. And the bones of the heroic dead were placed in a public sepulcher, and Pericles, the annual elected military chief, delivered the closing eulogy. Now, we don't know the actual words that Pericles uttered on that day in 431 BCE, but we have the account of the Greek historian Thucydides. This funeral oration, as reconstructed by Thucydides, is considered among the most eloquent in literature, and it represents one of the earliest expressions of the democratic ideal, because it shows how broad this idea of democracy really is. Those who died, Pericles argues, hadn't been fighting for king and country or hearth and home. They'd toiled in the service of a profoundly humane way of life. That's how the ancient Athenians saw it, and democracy to them wasn't merely a practical procedure for passing laws and placing government officials in office. The concept extended well beyond to embrace a deeper notion, the general empowerment of the governed by the governed, and the consequences and ramifications that logically follow from that. This is the larger democratic ideal as opposed to the mere procedural democracy we find in the act of voting. Relevant parts of Pericles' funeral oration clarify this and, more importantly, provide a benchmark against which modern societies can be measured. Pericles' funeral oration says, "It is true that we are called a democracy, for the administration is in the hands of the many, not the few. But while there exists equal justice to all and alike in their private disputes, the claim of excellence is also recognized. And when a citizen is in any way distinguished, he is preferred to the public service, not as a matter of privilege, but as a reward of merit. Neither is poverty an obstacle, but a man may benefit his country whatever the obscurity of his condition." In these few words, we find three democratic concepts: equal justice under the law, political inclusiveness, and public service as a civic duty and as a reward, all in a context that recognizes the value of accomplished, and by implication competent, public officials. Pericles next offers a description of a reasonable social tolerance of the varied expressions of individual freedom, along with some recognition of privacy, saying, "There is no exclusiveness in our public life, and in our private business we are not suspicious of one another, nor angry with our neighbor if he does what he likes. We do not put on sour looks at him, which, though harmless, are not pleasant." And he espouses respect for the rule of law, a concern for victims, and a community conscience, saying, "While we are thus unconstrained in our private business, a spirit of reverence pervades our public acts. We are prevented from doing wrong by respect for the authorities and for the laws, having a particular regard to those which are ordained for the protection of the injured, as well as those unwritten laws which bring upon the transgressor of them the reprobation of the general sentiment." Pericles further asserts that quality of life is important enough that it should be fostered by government, commercial, trade, and society. Quality of life, he said. "And we have not forgotten to provide for our weary spirits many relaxations from toil. We have regular games and sacrifices throughout the year. Our homes are beautiful and elegant, and the delight which we daily feel in all these things helps to banish sorrow. Because of the greatness of our city, the fruits of the whole earth flow in upon us, so that we enjoy the goods of other countries as freely as our own." He offers a bold affirmation of the open society, saying, "Then again, our military training is in many respects superior to that of our adversaries. Our city is thrown open to the world, and we never expel a foreigner and prevent him from seeing or learning anything of which the secret, if revealed to an enemy, might profit him. We rely not upon management or trickery, but upon our own hearts and hands." Now, such an affirmation is revolutionary in any age, especially given the focus on freedom of access for foreigners and an absence of government, especially military, secrecy, and disinformation. And then he states, "Our strength lies in our opinions, not in deliberation and discussion, but that knowledge which is gained by discussion preparatory to action. For we have a peculiar power of thinking before we act, and of acting too. whereas other men are courageous from ignorance, but hesitate upon reflection. Thus expressing the ancient Greek commitment to reason, unfettered freedom of inquiry, and the pursuit of knowledge. One can, of course, after you hear all this, ask how well Periclean Athens lived up to such noble sentiments. And the answer is that it failed in many ways. Slavery was an accepted institution. Political empowerment was limited to free adult males who were of pure Athenian descent. Full membership in society was thus denied to the majority of the Attic population. And Athens under Pericles had become an imperial power that economically oppressed other Greek city-states, a situation that led to the very war in which the eulogized Athenians had died, a lengthy internecine conflict of Greek fighting Greek. Nonetheless, even the level of democracy attained was highly unusual for the time. Not only was Greece unique in the ancient world in this regard, but democracy wasn't even universal among the Greek city-states. Sparta, for example, operated under a more autocratic system. So this great experiment in democracy was an imperfect minority view, yet it was also powerful enough in its influence to transcend centuries and continents to become the basis for the proliferation of democratic ideals in our time. That power stems from the broadness of its view. The democratic ideal includes freedom, personal fulfillment, social justice, inclusiveness, and the enfranchisement of the disenfranchised. This means there's no conflict between democracy and human rights. Human rights, rather, are a subset of the larger democratic ideal. All right, now given this, let's trace the history of the rise of human rights in the West and see what it tells us. But I'd like to start by asking you a few questions. How long do you think the notion of human rights has existed? I'd like a reaction from any of you. How long do you think the notion of human rights has existed in human society? Any thoughts?
100 years?
What?
About 100 years?
No, much longer than that.
All right, you say much longer than 100 years. How many?
It probably started back then. I know the Romans had rights and so forth, but they were citizens and they were males mostly. But
All right, so you say the Romans had human rights. All right, anyone else want to comment?
Hammurabi's Code?
Hammurabi's Code, you suggest, might have had something to do with human rights. All right, yes?
In the Garden of Eden, before Eve defied God.
In the Garden of Eden. Okay, well, I'm not going to get much help from you folks. All right. All right. Keep in mind that the framers of our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, they argued that human rights were as old as humanity. They were inalienable. They were part of natural law. Now, but do you think that's true? Do you think human rights are built into our nature as human beings? What are your thoughts on it? Some say yes, some say no. Good, we got some disagreement. All right. All right. Well, we should begin by noting that until the 17th century, the concept of a right was more like that of a privilege. Thus, there were the rights of Roman citizens, which constituted their entitlements. And during the Middle Ages, there were the feudal rights of barons, such as those rights wrested from King John of England after the Battle of Runnymede and spelled out in the Magna Carta. But that document is little more than a special interest list of demands issued by perhaps a third of the English barons to their sovereign in the midst of a civil war between them. In the centuries and civil wars that followed, however, this rambling reaffirmation of medieval English common law and custom gradually took on mythical significance. And from the 17th century forward, through legal reinterpretation, false reasoning, and bad historical scholarship, the Magna Carta became a convenient pretext on which to justify a number of truly revolutionary latter-day ideas about constitutional guarantees of individual liberty. Human rights theory as we know it today evolved out of the intellectual and religious ferment of Renaissance humanism and the Protestant Reformation to flourish and spread throughout the Enlightenment. And one of the first genuine juridical declarations of human rights to emerge from this process was England's Petition of Right, issued by Parliament in 1628. It outlaws forced quartering of soldiers, trial by martial law, and mandatory loans to the king. It also confirms the right to due process. Later, in 1679, Parliament passed the Habeas Corpus Act, which protects British subjects from being jailed indefinitely without charges or bail, imprisoned twice for the same offense, and forcibly transported to prisons outside the country. Does that sound familiar? Yes, we've done that sort of thing, haven't we? All right. This was followed by the Bill of Rights, which Parliament passed in 1689, a document that officially rendered England a constitutional monarchy where Parliament, not the king, made the laws, levied the taxes, and maintained the army. This document confirms that all subjects have the right to petition the king, all Protestants the right to bear arms, and all members of Parliament the right to freedom of speech during debate. It includes provisions against excessive bail and fines and forfeitures imposed prior to conviction of a crime, and cruel and unusual punishment. In the next century, with the flourishing of rationalism, came three major human rights documents. The first was the Virginia Declaration of Rights in this country. Written by George Mason, it was adopted by the Virginia Constitutional Convention on June 12, 1776, and later drawn on for the beginning paragraphs of the Declaration of Independence. It opens by proclaiming the existence of natural rights, life, liberty, and property. It then states that all power is from the people and all government is for the people. It champions freedom of the press, religion, and conscience, and it prohibits unwarranted searches and seizures. A person accused of a crime has the right to face accusers in a speedy jury trial, avoid self-incrimination, and be free of excessive bail and fines. Finally, those convicted are to be spared cruel and unusual punishment. Freedom of religion was developed further by the passage in 1786 of Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, leading up to what was James Madison's 1785 Memorial and Remonstrance. Or leading up to that was his Memorial and Remonstrance, written in opposition to a Virginia bill aimed at establishing a provision and funding for teachers of the Christian religion. In that document, Madison argues that religious belief, quote, can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. The religion, then, of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, end quote. Those rulers who would attempt to impose religion, Madison calls tyrants, and those of the people who submit to such imposition, he calls slaves. Strong language. And in his most famous passage, he lays down a principle that should always be remembered. It is proper, he said, to take alarm at the first experiment on our liberties. We hold this prudent jealousy to be the first duty of citizens, and one of the noblest characteristics of the late Revolution. So in other words, when someone tries to take away some of our liberties, when someone tries to experiment around, and you say, oh, well, it's only a minor thing, it's not a big deal. Yes, but then that's a foot in the door, and one thing leads to another. And so we have to jealously guard our rights and not let people get away with things around the fringes, because then one thing leads to another. Madison was particularly strong in advocating that. But Madison reserved his strongest and most eloquent language to the issue of the dangers of religion and of government efforts to dictate religion, saying, during almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What have been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Torrents of blood have been spilled in the old world by vain attempts of the secular arm to extinguish religious discord by proscribing all differences of religious opinion. All right, now the second major human rights document of the 18th century was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, drafted by Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès and adopted by the Constituent Assembly of France on August 26, 1789. It opens with the claim that, in the translation by Thomas Paine, ignorance, neglect, or contempt of human rights are the sole causes of public misfortune and corruption of government. It goes on to state that because the law is an expression of the will of the community, all citizens have a right to participate in its formation, and the specific rights enumerated in its 17 clauses include the freedom of opinion, particularly religious opinion, speech, writing, and publishing, as well as the liberty to do whatever does not injure another and isn't harmful to society. Each person is presumed innocent until convicted, and hence, when being captured and detained by legal authorities, should experience no more suffering than is necessary to secure his person. And I always think of that. Remember when Donald Trump made that comment, oh, you know how you put your hand on his head and let him in the police car and don't worry about that, just go ahead and let him bump his head, you know? Remember when he said that?
Yeah.
You know, you treat even a person you are sure is guilty of the most heinous crime, you treat everybody with decency. I remember when they hanged Saddam Hussein, and it was a big international scandal because someone spoke up and you know, uttered a taunt during his hanging. All right, and again, you just don't do things like that. We have this idea that we're going to proceed with a neutral concept of laws and rights and justice, and that we do whatever we do because we think it best and not out of vengeance and hatred and anger and getting even and things like that. All right, of course, on September 25th, 1789, Congress passed the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which has been nicknamed the Bill of Rights, and made them the law of the land. And we know those rights that are enumerated there. But keep in mind that all of these concepts of human rights so far have to do with civil liberties, individual freedom, your freedom to do whatever you want, and so forth. But it doesn't talk about any duties or obligations that the government may have, other than the government having duties and obligations to leave you alone or give you certain protections or whatever. But the so-called Jacobin Constitution of France in 1793 advanced something that's called social and economic rights, declaring that society owes subsistence to its unfortunate citizens, either by giving them work or assuring them the means to exist if they are incapable of work. Now, the idea didn't immediately take off, but with the gradual spread of democratic ideals throughout the 19th century, with the abolition of slavery and the advancement of civil and political rights of women and children, as well as the rise of socialism, the groundwork was laid for a dramatic shift in people's thinking. And that shift came as a result of rapid social, political, and economic transformation in Europe during and after World War I. In many of the national constitutions drawn up since 1915, there are provisions for free education, employment, unemployment assurance, and sickness and old age benefits. Such progress, however, hadn't been globalized. It took the trauma of World War II, with the widespread awareness of the massive and horrible human rights violations carried out by the Nazis, to give urgency to the creation of not only a workable International Council of Nations, but an international human rights standard. So the founding conference of the United Nations, held in San Francisco in 1945, took on the proposal that a Declaration of Rights should be developed and adopted. Well, a year later, the Commission on Human Rights was established. It set to work in 1947, electing Eleanor Roosevelt as chair. So Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the document, chaired the work that led to the document, the international, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Now, there's something that a lot of people don't know about Eleanor Roosevelt, because in fact, it was related in a private conversation. Back in the 1950s, Lloyd Moraine, a fellow who I know, was president of the American Humanist Association. And he knew Eleanor Roosevelt, and she read the book that Lloyd and Mary Moraine wrote, Humanism as the Next Step. And she read it, and she called him up, and she said, I'm a humanist. And this is a book that was very clear in saying what the humanism that you and I know of, you know, everything about it that we know, that was in that book. Now, that isn't something you're going to usually read everywhere because it wasn't usually prudent for people to state what their full views on things were, especially back then. But in any case, so she chaired the work on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what they decided was that 3 elements of this Universal Declaration were needed. First, a broad declaration to establish a common moral standard of achievement, a more limited convention or treaty to legally bind governments to conformity with specific terms, and a machinery of enforcement. And so, first, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came to fruition in 1948. 48 countries voted in favor, none voted against, and 8 abstained. And there's nothing in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that states that our rights come from God. It doesn't state that our rights come from nature. It doesn't state anything. It makes no metaphysical claim. It just states the rights. It states the usual human rights in terms of civil liberties, but it also goes on to address many of the social rights that I've been talking about and the necessity of good governments to provide for the people. And so this document then became binding on countries in 1966, and then they established the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights in 1985 so as to begin the process of enforcement. And since its adoption, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has spawned a host of particularized human rights documents, such as the UN Convention Against Torture and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Moreover, explicit references to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights appear in many different national constitutions adopted in the latter half of the 20th century and beyond. All right, all well and good. A lot of this is familiar territory to you. You often think about human rights, you know what they are. I'm pointing out that they are actually of recent vintage, which shows that human beings do invent new things. New things come along when people become more humanized in their thinking. But there is a criticism that has emerged. Philosophers have questioned the notion of universal human rights. As I already said, the claim was not made that they're based on natural law. The claim is not based on the idea that some God propounded these rights. So, some philosophers say this notion of human rights is a fiction, that it's just another example of philosophical naivete, enlightenment, arrogance, and Western cultural imperialism. A number of people in non-Western countries have tried to tell us this. Conservative Muslims, for example, object to such notions as women's rights and freedom of expression. In some African countries, Western efforts to stop such practices as female genital mutilation have been resisted as foreign interference. And there are others who just say, look, human rights, that's just a made-up idea, somebody concocted it, we like to make up rules and we follow them. Is this criticism valid? I want your feedback on this. What do you think about this criticism of human rights? You know what human rights are? Is it valid? Yes.
I say it's not valid because to me that seems to be an argument from the ethical structure known as cultural relativism. In other words, don't criticize our culture because that just leads us to criticizing yours. But the problem with that is once one adopts it, one can't even criticize their own culture. So to me, it seems like an ethical dead end.
All right, so you see it as an ethical dead end based on cultural relativism. So the idea that you know, you can do this in your culture and they can do that in their culture, and one culture can't criticize another, and one culture can't criticize itself or even change, right?
Correct.
So there's that criticism. Yes?
Hold on, I'm gonna
Well,
find it.
you bring up the categorical imperative, which is an extension of the golden rule. If you can't imagine yourself a woman living in, put yourself as a woman living in a Muslim society and agreeing to wear a beekeeper outfit, black and 120 degrees, if you can't envision yourself saying that would be good if I was such a woman, then I should have no right to try to inflict that type of life on females. So I think this cultural relativism, once you're subjected to the golden rule examination, falls apart.
Well, now you're mixing two things. You said the golden rule and you said the categorical imperative. They're two different things. But you're basically saying that the golden rule is what is, and it's held in common by cultures all over the world. So we'll go with that. I won't get into a discussion of the categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant. Yes?
Hold on, Annie.
Oh, I just wonder about two things. It is ethnocentrism that we in the Western world believe, you know, in these human rights. Furthermore, I do think that the tenets in all major religions are treat your neighbor like you want to be treated, and so there are two different issues here.
Well, do you think human rights are ethnocentric?
Right now.
All right, let's.
It's a tough one.
Okay, someone over here said yes. Let's hear about that.
They're clannish and tribalistic. I was thinking of right now our major ally in the Middle East. There are two flavors of Islam: Sunni and Shia. Iranians are Shia, which they don't blow themselves up as suicide bombers. But the Sunni do, which is the Wahhabism in Saudi Arabia, which where the bulk of the burqas are, he was speaking of, and Hillary Clinton basically wraps her head and covers it every time she visits Saudi Arabia. So there's a bit of hypocrisy in this respect we have for human rights, and we ship billions of dollars of war material to Saudi Arabia and back them so they can spread the very thing we say we're against, which is radical Islam. So, and colonialism. World War I, World War II were basically about who gets to colonize India, China, etc., and not to mention the Opium Wars. So the colonialism established this two-tier system of human rights, you know, one for the people in the West and the other for the people we conquered. So it's a little sketchy. And even with Jefferson, you know, the guy who had a 14-year-old slave girl talked about natural and inevitable rights and freedoms, and most of the founding fathers. So there's you know, some gray area.
Okay, so you see the ethnocentrism as being not inherently in the human rights themselves, but in the way we apply them. That we get more of them and they get less of them.
Our deeds.
What?
Our deeds speak louder than
Our deeds speak louder than our words. And, well, like I said earlier about the ancient Athenians, you know, they had these wonderful abstract ideals that they didn't always live up to. But they also had a system for criticizing them. The Greek playwrights sometimes challenged the status quo on certain ideas. Euripides, in particular, took Athens to task for a war that it fostered. He wrote the tragedy, The Trojan Women, and showed the horrors of war, and particularly the suffering of women, as a direct challenge to the foreign policy of Athens at the time. And so, yes, they didn't practice what they preached, but yes, they had the freedom of their playwrights to challenge that status quo. So there's a mix of good and bad in the practice. Okay, we have a question way over there.
I would be interested to know, you mentioned that in the voting on the Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 8 countries abstained.
Yes.
Do you happen to have a list of which 8 countries those were, and whether they are some of the areas that now resist the idea of human rights?
Gee, I should have brought my footnotes with me. I had them, but I haven't memorized them. What you could do is you could look that up. It's easy enough to find out. You probably
Do
find
you
it on
know if any of
Wikipedia.
those are some of the countries in which this is still being debated?
To my knowledge, yes.
Russia was one who declined and still declines.
Yes, Russia in particular. Well, see, countries that were committed to communism and certain other systems, they had their second, thoughts about this abstract idea of human rights because they didn't necessarily want it applied to them. Yeah, ideologies, whenever they're strong, have that effect. But at least they didn't vote against it. So it's often possible to say, all right, there's a court of world opinion that we can refer to, because no one has said categorically that they are against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and most of the nations are for it, and more nations have signed on since then. Yes?
So I guess when I'm thinking about this question, I'm trying to figure out what exactly you're asking. So are you asking if human rights are, let's say, written in the cosmos, like some a priori thing that we have to discover? Or are you asking if human rights are something that we invent? Because depending on which stance you take on that, I guess could be getting more to the root of your question. Is there some objective universal truth that is human rights, in which case we would assume then maybe human rights aren't ethnocentric, but our interpretation of them is, because it's based on the place in the world where we live?
Yes.
Or are human rights a manifestation of the place in the world that we live in the first place? Are we putting human rights into the cosmos? Are we dictating that out, right?
Yeah.
In which case you could say, well, human rights completely just depends on where you are, right? So I guess which question are you asking, or are you?
Both of them, and I appreciate your questions back to my questions, because this is exactly the conversation I'm trying to foster. Because we humanists, we love to talk about this stuff once we get into it, and I'm trying to get your reactions to what you think to both of those questions. Yeah.
To follow along with that same question, the idea of rights being something externally given to us, or something that we create together, that actually strikes to my earlier comment about cultural relativism, in that rights are, it is my opinion, and for more opinions on this, please visit Philosophy Under the Influence, where we talk about these topics and have a little drink on the side. The idea is that rights are not given to us from an external source. They're something that we all agree upon, and rights can be granted and they can also be taken away depending on the society, which is why, in my view, cultural relativism can actually be a hindrance to that progress.
Okay, very good. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I want to do a contrast with survival of the fittest and the development of human rights, which I think I'll use the evolutionary approach to that. They evolve and they have to survive just the way species do. If they're successful and they work, they gain acceptance the same way the dominant species do. They just do what they do, and then both are parallel. They're both, so you have a conflict between survival of the fittest, evolution, and survival of human rights, which survive because they appeal to enough people to become the power, and they become part of the culture.
Everybody get that?
No.
All right. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that as a segue to go into where I was going to go with this. All right. Because actually I pick up from all of that. So the point was raised, is it all cultural relativism in the sense that, your culture is good for you and my culture is good for me and never the twain shall meet and so on. Well, you can kind of sum that view up in this. Liberalism, the Western liberal tradition, liberalism for the liberals and cannibalism for the cannibals. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So if these folks do what they do over here, well, that's okay, and if we do what we do, that's okay. But Western cultural liberalism is something of a fighting creed, and I think we need to take a look at that. Because we maintain in this notion of human rights that although it's a human invention, and although it's a human invention that is localized in history, emerging in the 17th century first in England, but not totally alien to other people who, you know, once they're exposed to the idea tend to like it, there are reasons why this notion of human rights catches on. Okay, the first is human self-interest. Throughout history, large numbers of people have been oppressed by warlords and other dictators, but they were able to, these rulers were able to consolidate power and subdue majorities. And just think about the whole history of humanity, and you see rule by the few or rule by one. But over time, as the weak chafed under the heel of the strong, they would from time to time rise up in rebellion. The result, if successful, would sometimes simply enthrone a new dictator, often the one who had led the rebellion, but at other times, some amount of public control would be instituted. In the light of these developments, it can be argued that civilization constitutes a conspiracy of the weak against the strong, and the majority, or majority interests, against a minority of rulers. This leads us to the Enlightenment concept of the social contract. This is the idea that people can live peaceably together in groups because they come to certain understandings and make certain tacit agreements with one another for mutual benefit. For example, to avoid being harmed, they agree not to harm others. It's the golden rule in practice. The third point emerges from the struggle for survival, which you were talking about. In the Darwinian jungle, nature is a cruel and scary place. The strong survive and the weak die. But human intelligence has allowed people to think outside that box, to in effect seek to repeal the law of the jungle and build a society in which the weak are protected by the strong and life becomes easier for all through cooperation and ethical values. And archaeology has revealed that some of the earliest prehistoric societies protected the disabled. And the whole idea of modern medicine is to exempt humanity from the vicissitudes of natural disease and impairment. The fourth point emerges from the fact that we humans are social primates. We have an evolved empathy that allows us to feel for one another. Our values aren't all reducible to some form of self-interest. We can feel each other's pain as our own, put ourselves in their shoes, and thus care what happens to them. Democratic values are a natural consequence of this. It just takes a long period of history for us, through trial and error, to figure all this out. Now, that means that in practice, these values are first applied only locally, to family, clan, and tribe. All other people are regarded as outsiders and not relevant to our empathic concerns. The task of more humanized civilization, then, is to keep expanding the concept of us until it includes all of them. And that's what the history of human rights has ultimately been about. Recognizing all of us as one human family, entitling each one of us to the same rights and opportunities as everyone else. It is a widening of the inclusiveness of our natural empathy, something that the trial and error experience of history has led us to. All right, now what does all this have to do with humanism? Well, everything. In our efforts to apply our humanism to concrete issues, it's easy to lose sight of this big picture, what our overall values are and how they link together the matters we care about the most. So, I turn you back to an event a little over a year ago. On March 25th, 2017, the International Humanist and Ethical Union, headquartered in London, decided it was time to reiterate the broad democratic principles, including basic human rights, which are necessary for a humanized, civilized society. They issued the Brussels Declaration, a document that sets these principles forth. And so they argued that these are the principles of human rights and civil living that we all can agree upon. And they are held in common by all peoples and are found to some degree in every culture. In that sense, they are universal. They are based not on a single culture or tradition, but are founded on a variety of cultures, particularly the cultures that make up modern Europe. And so it was a document of 11 points, and I won't read you all of the points, but it's a lot of the familiar ideas that we have that we identify with our overall humanist values of democracy and human rights. And people from all over Europe have signed this statement since it was first posted to the internet in 2017, and it's a document that can be an inspiration to humanists everywhere. All right, but now here's a big question for you. Do these universal humanist values work? Do they, these ideas of democracy and human rights, do they, coupled with modern science, actually make the world better? Okay, we've propounded all of these wonderful ideas. Oh, we're just full of ideas. We have all these wonderful ideas. We think, boy, it would sure be good if everybody did what we think is right. Okay, now, since we've been propounding these ideas since the 17th century, has it made the world better? Or is the world a scarier and more violent and more dangerous place than it ever was? What's your reaction?
Significantly better.
Significantly better. Somebody, okay, put a microphone in that person's face. I hear significantly better. Tell me why it's significantly better.
Over the last 500 years, the violence in this world has dropped significantly. Wars are a lot less. I just read something yesterday, day before yesterday, that in Europe, since the 17th century, the murder rate has gone down by 30x. It's significantly better than what it was.
And you say that in the face of the 20th century having
Yes,
more deaths due to war and Holocaust and all of that. You say
Yes.
that in the face of that.
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Just having
Well, go ahead. Take
just
one.
having read the Steven Pinker's latest book, he points out that in almost every respect we are improving dramatically over 100 or several hundred years ago, and I was just amazed at his statistical analysis of all these different things, whether it's crime or war, longevity, health, the environment, you name it, we're getting better at it.
Okay, and that was the great promise of the Enlightenment, that if we stop just using, religion as our basis and faith and, and then fighting each other over who had the true faith, if we applied reason and observation and democratic values and the concept of human rights, we could actually build a better society, and this wasn't just a matter of opinion. We could roll up our sleeves and we could do it, and that was what's called the Enlightenment experiment. It was just an idea, wanted to see if it would work, but what's your reaction?
Well, I guess I want to say, first of all, I haven't read Steven
Pinker.
Pinker's book, but I am familiar with the argument. My thought is that we have improved, the world has improved dramatically, not because we are so wonderful in our approach, but I think in spite of it. And I look at the way people used to conduct their lives, centuries ago, where everyone was tied to the land, and nobody needed to, have a sense of, nobody needed to be literate. Today, if a country needs something to trade, they have to have a population that can negotiate the modern world, and so it's not that we are so magnanimous, but it's that there's a economic basis for bringing the poor and the wretched up to standards, what have you.
Well, then you're just saying we've all made the world more complicated, and so now you need to go to school for, up to 12th grade at least, and maybe college, before you can even live in this world we've created.
Well, some countries want to turn it back. They don't want their women to know how to work.
Yes, okay, some countries don't want that.
I hate to bring this up.
Oh, no, you don't.
I hate to bring this up, but this time next year, there will be another billion people added to the world's population. The ocean levels are rising. So if you consider these good times, you better enjoy them. Because if you listen to the same stuff that I do from Australia and Europe that I get on Free Thought Radio, I hope you'll all listen to, these people condemning us for our stand on climate change and everything. The horrors that I see on Vice News every night of these massive numbers in Myanmar, these huge numbers of people have no homes, that are moving into Bangladesh, and it's already overcrowded and waiting for the monsoons to come. And now that with all these, Saudi Arabia saying they're going to get the atomic bomb and everything, I think this is like the calm before the storm, and unless we do something, and the humanists have been behind the population control movement, and now when I watch these programs from Africa and Asia, where I see pregnant women carrying little kids around with them while they're starving to death, and we're cutting back birth control programs to go help them, I really don't have the same optimism that many of the people think that things are getting better because the murder rates.
All right, my wife wants to disagree with you. So,
I just read an article.
Well, wait for the microphone. By the way, to quote Stormy Daniels on Saturday Night Live to Donald Trump, I know you don't believe in climate change, but a storm's a-coming, baby. All right, so that sums up your argument. All right, Mary, go ahead.
I was gonna talk about, Fred and I just read an article recently about the problems with forced sterilizations and the problems that China has had.
And India.
And what India has had too. Everybody wanted a boy. So when they were pregnant, they had, they could see through ultrasound if it was a boy or a girl. If it was a girl, they aborted it. They're saying there's like 20, 30 million women missing from the or more than that missing from the population in India. And what happened in China, because everybody was only allowed to have one child, when they did have that one child, they spoiled them so much. Anything that child wanted. So now they've relaxed it. You can have more than one child in China now because it's caused such problems with forced sterilizations and everything.
It caused problems, but it also provided a solution for the overcrowding in China. I mean, we've traveled there a few times and spent quite a bit of time there. So while the one-child policy is kind of outmoded now, and they're allowed to have more. Before they could, but they had to pay a big fine or something if they did. It solved the problem that they had of the overcrowding.
But they don't. But now the men are having to go to other countries to get women. They're stealing women.
Well, we try this idea, we try that idea, and they aren't. China did assess the situation. Said, look, this is what the population's going to become if we don't do anything. And we aren't going to be able to sustain it. So we have to come up with a policy. So they come up with that policy, but it had unintended consequences. I don't know why they didn't think of them, but it had unintended consequences. And so now we're dealing with those. Yes, we oftentimes make a mess of things as we try to make them better, but even then, sometimes we make them better, even though we create new problems. All right, yes?
Generally speaking, from a humanist perspective, I guess the question was the world getting better? If you look at our cell phones are made and our Apple iPods are made by people in China, and there's a company called Foxconn that basically goes around the world and looks for the cheapest labor. We're talking 15, 25 cents an hour to make our gadgets. Our country's been hollowed out and deindustrialized. The industrial jobs have been shipped overseas. They're not coming back. Glass-Steagall is still gone. Dodd-Frank is basically milquetoast, and we're headed for another crash. So I don't think it's really getting better. I think we've managed to gloss over it. I think we've managed to put a pretty face on something as ugly as colonialism. And that's what Foxconn is basically, is just the new colonialism. So I don't think generally it's getting better. We killed 3.8 million people in Vietnam, a country that never attacked us. Mm-hmm. And we're sort of saying, oh, well, things are looking up. I don't think so.
Okay, but however many were killed in this war or that, the point has been made that if you look at it per capita, you know, the percentage of the world's population that find life nasty, brutish, and short is much less, you know, percentage-wise than it was in times past. You wouldn't have wanted to live in the Middle Ages. Yes, we didn't have the horrible weapons that could be, you know, we had weapons of individual destruction instead of weapons of mass destruction. But they were wielded percentage-wise against more people. And the bubonic plague destroyed percentage-wise more people than pandemics today. Today, you have a volcano erupt, you have a hurricane come, we evacuate the people, and very few people, relatively speaking, die from natural disasters in our time compared to what used to die in natural disasters. They recently found the remains of children that were hundreds of children who were sacrificed by an empire in South America back just before the Incas took over that group. And they had sacrificed them because they were having the equivalent of an El Nino, and it went on for years. And as a and in an area that was usually a dry climate, and they were having all these heavy rains. They didn't know what to do. They didn't have the science. They didn't have a system for dealing with it. They thought they just had to appease their gods better. So first they sacrificed adults, and the storms kept coming. So then they sacrificed children. So you could see how magical thing, and that was all they had. They were grasping at straws. But the great promise of the Enlightenment was, we're going to have science that's going to actually solve these problems. And sure enough, when we have storms today or volcanoes or whatever, we evacuate people. We have ways of knowing these are coming in advance. We don't have to turn to religious belief that doesn't prove anything and just make a superstitious appeal.
Do you realize we kill millions of children and we call it collateral damage?
Yes,
right?
I know we do that.
Millions.
I know we do that. But per capita, you know, what is the percentage of people who die? If you look at human sacrifice in the Americas, if you look at the devastation through wars, constant wars in the Middle Ages in Europe, or the constant war, the number of people killed by Genghis Khan in his time was tremendous percentage-wise. The massive numbers. He had one of the most organized forces for destruction, you know, to the point that even modern military experts study his techniques for winning battles because they were so devastatingly effective. So there's much to be said when you look at it percentage-wise. But when you look at the raw numbers, yes, there are more people in actual numbers who die today in devastating ways precisely because there are so many people to begin with, and we have weapons that can kill so many all at once. All right. What I'd like to add to this is this, that in January of this year, Nicholas Kristof, in his column in the New York Times, declared 2017 the best year in human history. And he said, why? Because a smaller share of the world's people, are hungry, impoverished, or illiterate than at any time before. He wrote, a smaller proportion of children died than ever before. Proportion. The proportion disfigured by leprosy, blinded by diseases like trachoma or suffering from other ailments also fell. Every day the number of people around the world living in extreme poverty, less than $2 a day, goes down by 217,000. Every day 325,000 more people gain access to electricity, and 300,000 more gain access to clean drinking water. In another 15 years, illiteracy and extreme poverty will be mostly gone. And so it's already been mentioned about Steven Pinker. His book is called Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. So he links this all together with our philosophy. And he demonstrates in a most dramatic and compelling way that humanism works and is making the world better with each passing day. So Kristof wrote, the most important thing happening right now is not a Trump tweet, but children's lives saved and major gains in health, education, and human welfare. However, we still live in perilous times because we have weapons of mass destruction. We can do incredible damage to ourselves, And one wrong move and we can upend all of the good that all of this progress has done. So this is no cause for cheering or dropping your guard, but we should focus our attention on the areas that need our attention, not the areas where we have actually achieved success. Only use those successes as a springboard to say, look, we can do it. Now, I got my first taste of this attitude of we human beings can make the world whatever we want it to be if we just work together for a common cause and roll up our sleeves and get the job done. I learned that as a child. The March of Dimes. I put my dimes in those little cards back when I was a kid in the 1950s in elementary school, and I helped end polio. I participated in wiping a scourge out from the planet Earth. Everyone was on board with this kind of thing. There wasn't anybody saying, no, let's keep polio. It's God's punishment for polio victims. You know, nobody was saying that. Everybody got behind this. And the scourge was essentially wiped off from the planet Earth. What that convinced me of, I didn't fully realize it at the time, but as I think back on it, it taught me the incredible power that human beings have to make their world. But of course, that power is a two-edged sword. We can make a mess of the world, too. We can cause sea level rise. We can pollute the air. We can do all sorts of destructive things. We are powerful, and when we get organized, we can do a lot of good. So we have to recognize our power. Because when you think of all the different animals that are spread around the planet Earth, there is no animal except one that occupies every continent. And it isn't the cockroach. It's human beings. We occupy every continent. Yes?
Except tardigrades.
What?
Except tardigrades.
What's that?
It's a little bug.
The little thing, the extremophile.
Oh. All right, so the big question we can ask, in light of this, what can we individually do as humans to pick up on this positive thread and make an impact in our community and beyond? Convinced of our power, can we then direct people to use it? Also, how can we rededicate ourselves to the democratic ideal and take action to rescue and secure democratic values wherever they are threatened? Likewise, what can we do to foster a greater understanding and appreciation of science, which has given us so many of the things that are so useful in helping make the world better and saving lives? Our humanist values have been too long in the making and too beneficial to civilization to allow us to let them slip away. Yes?
One of the things we can do is vote out the representatives in Congress who are not in favor of science and yet are supportive of big oil, to the fact that they vote against any attempt at affecting climate change. They vote to get out of agreements, global agreements that we've made, and this is all toward the destruction of our country.
Yeah.
And that's right here.
Right.
And we, in this country, have the worst, I don't know what to say. We have, I'm sorry, what? Well, not the
We
worst.
consume more natural resources than anybody else.
Than anybody else. I mean, we're pigs.
All right, well, yeah, no, the environmental footprint. Is that what you're talking about? Our ecological footprint? Yes.
But you were talking about democratic values, humanistic values. I think the greatest thing we can do is to basically wash away this hypocrisy and stop, and start really exporting democracy and not dictators like Pinochet, the Shah of Iran,
Yes.
and the Saudis in dictatorship. We should literally support democracy and not dictatorships, and that would, that would go a long way to helping the rest of the world realize that we are what we say we are, instead of what we, you know.
Right, and as you're pointing out, the first step in doing that is to realize that we have been hypocrites, you know, to realize that we haven't really been spreading democracy the way we like to say we have been, and to see what we're really doing honestly, and then say, wait, what are our values again? Check your values again, make sure, you know, that you're acting consistently with them. Yes?
I'd like your opinion on the magic phrase that you used before called the social contract.
Yes.
That if indeed we have a meaningful society, everyone contributes. However, the libertarian view is that I take mine and become as rich as I can, and to hell with you. You don't get an education, you don't get welfare unless you earn it yourself. How can we have a social contract in this kind of environment?
Well, remember, when you expose certain ideas for what they are, then you find that a lot of people don't buy into them. But you have to expose them for what they are, that they're in that kind of libertarian view. It really does hark back to the law of the jungle, the idea that the strong should survive, or the smarter should survive, and the weaker should fail, and that if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, you'll have beautiful tree-lined streets and illuminated at night, and they'll be paved, and then if you're a poor person, you'll be on a dirt road, and that's somehow justice. But the point is that civilization, in my view, and I think in the humanist view basically, is civilization is a conspiracy of the weak against the strong for the betterment of all. And it is an attempt to upend the law of the jungle because we don't want to live that way. We've done that, been there, done that. Ain't pretty. Okay, so we don't want that. So libertarianism, in my view, is an intellectualization of the law of the jungle. And we know what that's like. And we've had enough of it. And it's kind of a sociopathology as well. You know, obviously I'm no friend of libertarianism. And you're free to disagree, but that's kind of the way I view it. Yes?
There's kind of two things when I think about democracy in this country. First of all, it's supposed to be a democratic republic.
Right.
If we think about Plato's republic, I would ask whether we live in a republic or a democratic republic, or if we live in a tyranny. I think we very much live in a tyranny. I don't think we live in a republic in which we elect our officials and our officials do the will of the people who elect them, right? And I also wonder, is it good for us to be duped in this idea that we're a vote that matters on voting day? Yeah, it's important to vote, but we're duped in this idea that if we show up and vote on voting day, then if we vote for the right person to get in office, all of our problems will be solved. But that's not what happens, right?
Right.
So we need to accept this fact that our vote is every day in our actions. We need to make those actions every day. If we want education to be better, we need to take actions to make education better. We can't just pretend that we're going to vote for some savior to come in and solve everything for our society. So I think in a way, like, we tell ourselves that we live in a democracy, but we don't. We live in a tyranny, and then we pretend that the tyranny that we live in is a democracy, and that if we vote for these people, somehow all of our problems are going to be solved, and we're complacent, like sitting on our couch and doing our day-to-day job and basically sacrificing our lives. I mean, we talk a lot about quality of life, but we haven't, or quantity of life, but we haven't talked about quality of life at all.
Yeah.
So what if people are living longer? If you work 60 hours a week, 2 part-time jobs, barely make enough ends meet, or barely make enough to make ends meet, just so you can make some plastic thing that someone's going to buy and throw away, who cares how long I'm living, right? So, like, what about quality of life, and what about, like, taking that personal responsibility to stop pretending that this democratic process is going to make everything better, right?
Because quick and easy, we want it quick and easy,
right,
and magical thinking.
Right.
And we're against both of those.
I know, but we don't act that way.
Right. Well,
why not?
speak for yourself. No, we need to mobilize. Absolutely,
Yeah.
we
Well,
need
I'm not
to
saying
mobilize.
this room doesn't.
Yeah, well,
I'm
okay,
saying,
but
you know,
that's right. We need
but
to
there's
get
only
more
two.
people to realize, you know, yes, pay attention to that man behind the curtain. You know, there are things going on, and we need to expose them. All right. Any other? Yes.
Our votes in November are important, but we also have to remember that every day we need to let our representatives know how we feel and what we're doing. And we need to talk to our neighbors about how we are doing and what we can do together, because it's like the teachers. I mean, they finally got together. One by one, they said, I've had enough. West Virginia started it. Bless West Virginia, because you can't bless them for much else. West Virginia started it, and that can energize the rest of us. I've been horribly depressed since November 2016. I can't tell you, I worked so hard in 2016. But I have to think, I have to spend my money the right way. I have to support the groups that are supporting my ethics. And sometimes it hurts, but I have to do it. And I have to keep talking to the representatives, even the ones that are on my side, as well as the ones who are not. So Flake and McCain still here for me. Ruben, Athena, Stella, and Juan still here for me, because they have to remember that I'm still out here, and I'm not the only one, and we are not the only ones. But unless we work together, and unless we support monetarily, as well as with our walking and our talking, we're going to fail. And if we fail, that's for my great-grandchildren. I can't fail because of my great-grandchildren.
All right, well, excellent. And that's the point, is that I'm hoping that by us talking about these things, we can become more energized to do something. And if there's any consolation to be found in the current situation, it's that the folks who thought this would be a solution are now seeing how bad it can be when you abandon these democratic values and human rights. See what a mess it makes. Sometimes people have to have their noses rubbed in it to see how bad it can be. And you really couldn't think of a more iconic example of how bad things can be than who we have sitting in the Oval Office right now. So sometimes, you know, you have to point the finger and say, yeah, that's what you don't do. Yes?
Yeah, I just would like I taught for most of my life, and I used to teach my kids that we don't have democracy in this country. We have a plutocracy, because plutocracy identifies how our government works, who gets what they want, and by calling ourselves a democracy, we give ourselves the impression that we're misleading ourselves. And I think as long as we consider ourselves a democracy instead of a plutocracy, I don't think we're going to get to the core of the problem, because we have illusionary democracy when in fact we have a plutocracy.
Well, I agree with your point about plutocracy, but I'm talking about democratic values, that we as humanists hold up democratic values. That doesn't mean we're going to go around saying, and so we have a democracy and everything's fine. No, we advocate democratic values. Then we notice the inconsistencies of them in practice, as I noted in the case of ancient Athens, when they didn't live up to their own principles as well. But they were great principles, so we stand by the principles. All right, I'm going to take yours as the last thought, and then we're going to
We have something that we engage in Europe called protest democracy. So in France, for example, every other week there is a strike, the unions are very, very involved. But here in the United States, typically people are not involved in elections in democracy unless it is every 4 years that they vote for president. And typically, 40% of people that are registered to vote that actually vote.
Yeah.
So there have been many amazing social changes here since Trump, who is going to make the United States great again. And I think he will, because people are now starting to get involved with this Me Too movement and Walk for Your Life movement and Red for Ed and so on. I really think that he's going to do it, but not in his way.
Right.
We are taking our power back.
Yeah, you have to get angry. There is a place for emotion. It isn't all calm, sweet reason. But reason is the guide to finding the answers. But then once you've decided what the answers are, as Saul Alinsky advised in Rules for Radicals, then you go after it like all the good arguments are on your side and all the bad arguments are on the others, and you get fired up and you do it, and you get creative. You get creative and you do interesting things. And of course, that's a whole other lecture about how you organize and do interesting things and how you foster interesting protests that wake people up and all that. But all I wanted to talk to you about tonight is that we have a tiger by the tail here. We have these humanist values that are good values. We need to use them and wield them because they are powerful, and when they work wonderfully well and make the world better. And when they don't work and when they're not used enough, then things go the wrong way. Our values matter, and one thing that makes humanists stand out, I think, from others is that we know that ideas matter. Ideas are important. And we here are gathered around the ideas of humanism because we know those ideas matter, and now we just need to be sure we are ready, willing, and able to put them to work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We wanted to please help yourself to some more food and chat we're here for another half hour. But we do have something for you, Fred.
All right.
We have a tradition here at Humanist Society that we like to mug our speakers.
Oh,
So,
okay.
You're your first official. Hopefully there'll be many more to come and when you come back to visit us. So thank you very much. And
Thank
please
you.
another round.
Was there some way we were supposed to help pay for these things we ate tonight? I didn't see a way when I came in.
There's a glass jar right here. Just if you feed the glass jar, that'll help pay for the food and for Fred's expenses here. Yes, we do have food in the back. Please help yourself to it. And if you could, that'll help us clean up. If you see anything left,